Last Sunday, we looked at an in-depth passage of Jesus' betrayal and arrest following his attempts to prepare his disciples for what was coming. According to Mark, after Jesus' arrest, in a sort of humorous account that includes one young man having his tunic torn off and fleeing naked, the disciples scatter. They are fearful that they will be arrested along with Jesus and that they will suffer his fate. So as Jesus is being seized and led away, the 11 run for their lives. They all escape arrest. And it doesn't mention exactly where they went, except for one of them. Peter escapes and flees, but for some reason he hangs back and he follows Jesus as he's being led away. And we're going to see what happens with Peter and with Jesus in today's passage. So if you have your Bible, I hope you do. Please turn to Luke chapter 22. This week we're going to study Luke 22, verses 54 to 56. This is a passage that no doubt many of you are very familiar with. And if you were here a few weeks ago, you will have seen how Jesus predicted exactly what would happen here. Again, that's Luke 22, verses 54 to 65. Verse 54 begins, "Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. But when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, 'This man was with him.' But he denied it. 'Woman, I don't know him,' he said. A little later, someone saw him and said, 'You also are one of them.' 'Man, I am not,' Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, 'Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean.' Peter replied, 'Man, I don't know what you're talking about.' Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. 'Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times.' And he went outside and wept bitterly. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, 'Prophesy! Who hit you?' And they said many other insulting things to him. So after Jesus is arrested, he's seized and he's led away, and the disciples flee and scatter. But Peter doesn't seem to be quite ready to distance himself from the situation fully. He follows from a safe distance. We're told that Jesus is led to the home of the high priest. And it's interesting, the high priest that they're speaking of isn't named specifically here. We're not told if it's Ananias or Caiaphas or perhaps even another high priest, a former high priest that had orchestrated Jesus' actual arrest. But they're taken to the home of this powerful person. And which person they are isn't really important as an individual. What they represent is important. And this high priest represents the institutional religious power structure that is opposed to Jesus. And in that sense, one high priest is just the same as any other in this context. And Jesus is being taken there because these religious authorities need to get their ducks in a row before they take him to the Romans. The Romans are the only ones who can execute him, and that's what they want. But they know they need to get a serious charge that they can hang on him before they take him before the Romans. So they are going to not only arrest him, but they are going to interrogate him and beat him and get their story straight before they appear before the Romans. They don't want there to be any chance that Jesus could escape the punishment they want for him by convincing Pilate or another Roman authority that he's really not a threat. So they are going to make sure they have this in the bag before they show up there. Of course, because there's always the risk that if you show up unprepared, things may go wrong, and Pilate might not see him as the threat they want to see him as. They want him to be seen as. So they are going to leave nothing to chance. They are going to prepare him and their story before they even try to take him before Pilate. In this, Peter is frightened, but he's not yet prepared to fully abandon Jesus to the authorities. And perhaps he's in some way trying to pluck up the courage to keep the promise he had made to Jesus, to fulfill the boasts that he had proclaimed earlier that night when he told Jesus, I'll follow you to jail or even to death. I am ready. And of course, we know that he wasn't ready. He has no idea what to do. He follows and he's confused and he's indecisive and he doesn't know what, if anything, he can do. Eventually, he builds up enough courage. And this is pretty brave, and it shows that for all of his faults and failings, Peter really does love Jesus, because he builds up the courage to go into the courtyard of the chief priest's home, where Jesus is being held with all of the people who are gathered there, the crowd that came to arrest him, no doubt other people who have since arrived. He's gone into the heart of the camp of Jesus' enemies. But he hasn't done it in a way that announces who he is. He sort of sneaks in surreptitiously and takes a place among them. And we know from the previous passages that he is not prepared for this. He has not prayed as Jesus has told him to pray. He has not asked for God to give him strength or keep him from temptation. And we also know that he is going to be exposed to intense testing and pressure. And we're going to see that in this passage, and that the pressure that he is going to face, which he's completely unprepared for, is going to show his boasting from earlier tonight to be completely empty. Verse 55 continues, and when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down with them. So picture a sort of grand home of the time. This is the home of a powerful person. In fact, some historians would even say that this may have been a complex of homes of rich and powerful priests. Multiple high priests that were related, were part of one family, may have lived in different wings of this large, grand home. And a home like this would have had a very large courtyard that would have been a semi-public place where people who were coming to see the high priest would be taken in to wait till they were either invited in or they were sent away. And so as Jesus is brought here, there's a large crowd in here, and this is the early spring. This would have been likely a chilly, cold night. And so as people are there waiting, someone lights a fire, and Peter slips close to the fire and takes a seat there. He sits down among Jesus' captors. Verse 56 continues, a servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, this man was with him. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him, he said. So Peter is sitting there among Jesus' enemies, and the light of the fire exposes him. This is, I think, a sort of interesting and poetic way. He's being sifted, he's being tested, and he is struggling in the darkness, but the light reveals his face. And as his face is revealed by this firelight, someone suspects that he is not one of the party of the enemies of Jesus, but one of Jesus' own disciples there. And this slave girl who has this suspicion announces it to the group and questions him. Now, we're not told exactly what gave Peter away to her, but the announcement, the alarm of this slave girl is enough to break Peter, to crack him. And it's true that he is certainly in some danger here, right? He is amongst a bunch of enemies. He has just seen Jesus be arrested and taken here, and certainly these people are no friend of Jesus' disciples. But he's also not being threatened by some big temple guard or some large house servant or some important, wealthy, powerful elder. He's being called out by a slave girl, someone who most people would, and apparently from the text, did ignore. And that's enough for him to shout out, "Woman, I don't know him." Now, Peter's denial here, I think it's certainly fair to say that fear plays a big part in it, but I think there's also an element in which Peter is disappointed, and he's kind of broken. He has seen Jesus, who he declared to be the Messiah, more than once arrested. He may have believed that his hopes in Jesus as the Messiah had been dashed, and that earlier when he was boasting, he believed, hey, I am willing to die for the cause of the Messiah. But now, as he doubts, perhaps he even doubts that Jesus is the Messiah, that has turned to, while maybe I would die for the Messiah, I'm not prepared to die in a lost cause. So there's fear, and there is perhaps desperation and disappointment and despair. And all of these are pressing down on Peter. And if you remember back to when Jesus prophesies about what Peter will do this night in denying him, he starts the prophecy not by calling him Peter, but by calling him Simon. And Peter, the name that Jesus gave to Simon, means rock. He's supposed to be solid and strong, but he's not that yet. God has not shaped him into that yet. And the pressure that he's under right now is causing him to crack and crumble. And it's significant here that Peter's denial of Jesus echoes the words that a congregation in the synagogue would say to someone who they are casting out. Woman, I don't know him. When you were cast out of the synagogue, when you were cast out of polite society, the group that was casting you out would say, we do not know you. This isn't a statement of ignorance. This isn't necessarily a statement of, I don't know who you are. This is a denial of any sort of relationship or affiliation. This is cutting someone off. I don't know you. Like saying, I never knew you. You are not one of us, and you will never be. This is the pronouncement that comes out of Peter's mouth here. More than just a statement of, I'm not who you think I am. The very words are words of disassociation, of breaking ties. We're told that a little later someone else saw him and said, you are one of them. And again, Peter says, man, I am not. He denies him. So while the servant girl was apparently ignored, no one paid attention to her claim, or Maybe the crowd gets distracted for a moment. Some time passes and another person recognizes him. And this time, Peter is accused of being one of them. This kind of reveals that among this crowd, among the servants of the high priest, and perhaps even among a segment of the population in Jerusalem, Jesus and his followers had become sort of infamous and notorious. You're one of them. And Peter flatly and emphatically denies being a disciple of Jesus for the second time. More time passes, and we're told about an hour later, someone else asserts, certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter replies again, man, I don't know what you're talking about. So this third person again repeats the accusation that Peter is a follower of Jesus, and Peter denies it. Now this person cites the fact that Peter is a Galilean as some sort of evidence or proof of his claim, and this makes sense because if you think about who would have been servants of the chief priests and the elders, it would have been local people in Jerusalem. And so the fact that among all these people who are somewhat known to one another and have the same accent and way of speaking and the same mannerisms, there's this one person who is very identifiably from someone else. It's sort of like if everyone in a room is from the South and then someone from Boston walks in and starts talking. It doesn't take long to notice that they speak and act differently. Peter sticks out like a sore thumb because he is a Galilean, and there's also another layer to this. There's perhaps a prejudice and a contempt, saying, someone like you, someone from this northern backwater in Galilee, this simple person, is exactly the type of fool who would fall for a charlatan like Jesus. So you're here, you're not one of us, and you look exactly like the type of person who would be taken in by Jesus. You are probably one of them. And again, Peter emphatically denies knowing Jesus. And then the text continues. Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. So up to this moment, it seems that Peter has been caught up in the dangerous and emotional events of the night. His mind certainly wasn't on what was said at dinner a few hours ago by Jesus, or probably on a lot or anything of what Jesus had taught. His mind is completely focused on what is going on in that minute. He's caught up in the emotion. He follows. He doesn't know what to do. He's pressured and he backs down and denies knowing Jesus. And then, after the third denial, the rooster crows and Jesus makes eye contact with him. And it had to be like getting a cold bucket of water thrown in his face. Snapped him back to reality and to memory. As I was thinking about this week, I had the picture of, if you've ever been driving along distracted, maybe you're caught up in the cares and worries of the moment, and your mind is a million different places, and you're filled with worry and distress. What am I going to do? I need to get here. I need to go here. I need to do this. My mother's sick. How are we going to pay the bills? And then all of a sudden, in your distraction, you plow into the back of another car. That has the effect of bringing reality right back upon you in a minute. That's what I think Peter kind of felt at that moment, is he has betrayed Jesus 3 times. And then at the moment of that third denial, he looks up and sees Jesus staring back at him and the rooster. Now I think it is important to not just understand the part of the prophecy that's been fulfilled here, but also the part that hasn't yet been fulfilled. Because Jesus told Peter that he would do this and that all this would happen before the rooster crowed. But he also told him that when you turn back, when you repent, strengthen your brothers. So the one who followed him and came a little bit farther than the others, but still failed miserably to be faithful as a disciple, is charged with encouraging those who failed a little more quickly than him. And I think it's probably safe to say that while looking into Jesus' eyes at that moment was absolutely heartbreaking for Peter, because I believe Peter really loved Jesus. Peter really wanted to follow Jesus. I don't think that the Lord's eyes at that moment were full of disgust or condemnation or disappointment. I think they were filled with compassion and mercy and a little bit of encouragement, saying, remember I told you this would happen? Remember what else I told you would happen? You're going to make it through this. And this is all too much for Peter, and we're told that he runs out of the courtyard and weeps bitterly. This is a huge contrast between Peter and Judas. We see in Scripture that Judas was also discontent with his betrayal of Jesus, but he never has this moment of turning back. He never has this moment that Peter has here where Peter sees himself for who he is and is devastated by that, but is also turns back towards the Lord. Judas feels sorry for himself and disgusted for what he does, but he has no hope and he sees no hope. And it causes his death. It causes his destruction. In Peter, we have something very different. And so Peter flees, and no one bothers to go after him. He's just gone. They have the person they came to arrest, and perhaps there's also a little bit of the idea that someone who is so easily cowed and broken and flees, weeping bitterly, he's no threat to us. We'll just let him go. They were done with him. But we know from the text that Jesus wasn't done with him. After this, after Peter flees, we can see the first taste of what Jesus is going to endure. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophecy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. So again, the chief priest and the authorities have a definite and certain purpose for why they have taken Jesus to this home. They are going to prepare him to be condemned at trial before the Romans. And they're beginning the first part of this. And the first part of this is interrogating him and beating him. The word in the text began mocking here is not just making fun of him. This is a humiliating torture. It is making a fool out of him by cruelty, being cruel to him for all to see. What they would have done is they would have blindfolded him and taken turns striking him and then asking him, basically, if you're such a great prophet, tell us who hit you. They're mocking his claim to be a prophet. And there's a tremendous irony here, because as they are mocking him because they believe he is a fake prophet, a prophecy that he made this very night that has come true to the letter has just been fulfilled in their presence. The irony is that he predicted he would be betrayed by Judas. He predicted that Peter would deny him 3 times. He predicted that he would be reckoned with transgressors and treated as a robber. And he predicted what happens to prophets in Jerusalem. They're killed. So as they are cruelly tormenting him and ridiculing him because they think he's a false prophet, he is being shown to be a true prophet. Everything he has said will happen, has happened, or is happening. And from this passage we can see a few really important lessons. The first is that Peter's failure here is a clear example of how pathetic empty boasting can be. And I have to say that myself, probably all of us, can really easily fall into this as well. Think of some of the things that we sing and we claim that we have to know we have no power in ourselves to bring about. Think of songs like, "All to Jesus I surrender. Take my silver and my gold, not a mite will I withhold. Where he leads, I'll go." Now, I'm not saying these are things that we shouldn't sing or things that we shouldn't say, but what I am saying is that we need to be careful not to believe that you can do these things out of your own strength or your own goodness, because you can't. The only way we have any hope of ever doing anything remotely like surrendering all to Jesus or giving everything that we have for his glory or following wherever he leads is through his strength, is through the Spirit, is through the faith that we can't give ourselves or we can't grow ourselves. It has to be given to us. We can also see here that through this time, Peter wants to be a follower of Jesus, wants to be a good disciple, but he tries to blend in. He comes to this crowd of Jesus' enemies and he sits down and he tries to pretend that he's one of them, and when he is questioned and when he is pushed against, he crumbles. There's a warning in this, is that we as followers of Jesus have to decide whether or not we want to blend in or whether or not we want to stand out as disciples of Jesus. Because as this was going on, you can bet that Jesus was standing out as the Son of God. Peter wasn't ready to do that. And as a Christian, if you're trying to blend in, you have to know that non-Christians will always disapprove of you and will always judge you harshly. They will either think that you are judgmental and self-righteous, or they'll think that you are naive and foolish and believe in fairy tales. But there is no way to blend in. And I want to warn you, do not underestimate your capacity to be disloyal if you value blending in. Because that temptation will be there. If you want to hide out by the fire and just kind of check things out until it's safe, it's never going to be safe. And if you try to do that, and you're pressured like Peter, your reaction will be no better than Peter's. I can guarantee it. Another thing we can see here is that Peter is humbled and humiliated here. But he's humbled and humiliated, and through that, he's made wiser. Peter, after this, I can guarantee you, knew more about himself and more about God than he did going into this situation. He saw very clearly that he doesn't have the strength or the courage to do what he needs to do to follow Jesus. But he also saw more clearly than he ever had before who Jesus was. Because as he is failing so miserably with the slightest amount of pressure, Jesus is boldly proclaiming exactly what he proclaimed before, boldly witnessing about him being the Messiah, being the Son of God, even as he's being beaten and tortured and pushed towards the cross. Peter, through this, I think, comes to see that Jesus didn't choose him because of anything good about Peter, but only because through God's grace and mercy and Peter's weakness, God will be glorified. One commentator put it really well when he said, we would all benefit from a little less spiritual self-esteem and a little more spiritual dissatisfaction. We could all benefit from being a little more humble in thinking that, yeah, God saved me, but I'm still pretty good, and I'm still pretty strong, and I'm still pretty brave, and I think I could endure where others failed. Now, all through this, Jesus gives the example that we ought to follow. The perfect counter-example to Peter. Where Peter fails, Jesus most certainly does not. And this goes way back. This doesn't just happen at the moment where Jesus is arrested and beaten and mocked. It began way, way, way before this. As Peter was boasting, as Peter was saying, I would follow you to death, Jesus wasn't boasting of his own courage. Jesus was praying. Jesus was preparing others. Jesus was getting ready for this moment. And then when the moment comes, Jesus doesn't hide. He doesn't run away. He isn't broken. He stands up and proclaims the truth. Jesus paves the way, and he's the example we need to follow. And the great thing about this is that we can read a little further on. Peter fails here, but he doesn't later on. After Jesus shows him the way, after God sends him the Spirit, Peter does stand up boldly and witness, as do many others. And Peter himself goes to his death rather than deny Christ in his crucial moment. Now, what transformed the man that couldn't stand up to the questioning of a slave girl to someone who would submit to being crucified upside down for the sake of Jesus? It was the faith that God gave him, and it was Jesus' example that brought him there. Please pray with me. Father, I thank you for the life that your Son led and for the example that he is to us. And I pray that as we are tempted by the cares and concerns of the world, that we are tempted to try to blend in and to hide, to make an easy way for us. I pray that you will give us the faith to stand boldly, not to run out of fear or timidity. Father, I pray that you would make us into disciples who are willing to follow you everywhere, who are willing to give up everything we have. We know that we cannot do that, but only you can make us that. Father, I thank you for your Son, for his sacrifice, for his life, for his death, for your grace and your mercy upon us because of what he has done. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.